pivot back to why I took the position that I did, is because education is such an incredible tool to provide the necessary skills for our children early on, so that they can become compassionate, merciful, kind, caring individuals in all aspects of decisions that they make in life and that they take in life, which all leads to empathy. Unfortunately, with a lot of the current modern issues and things that we have to deal with, I almost fear that we're almost getting away from that, because we're rewarding kids to become antisocial rather than social. And that's what we're doing with technology, aren't we?
Yes.
Because we're basically marrying a child to his or her computer or a gadget more so than the human. And since the time of Adam and Eve, we've all interacted with human beings, and that's the form of relationships we know as a base, not with some computer or gadget that we've created ourselves. So I think there's a lot to be said about what we're doing as a society, particularly in the education sector, what we're doing to our children, and what it also, kind of forces me to believe more and more so, is that parents have an incredibly much more important role to play in their children's lives than they did in the past. Because in the past, schools kind of did a little bit of the upbringing of the child. Now, for many reasons, schools are not supposed to, schools are not allowed to. So the entire pressure of raising a good child falls back on the family, the adults that the kid is being raised under, and that environment. And then we also know, unfortunately, how much that space is being troubled with all various things. So it's a complicated thing, and I don't know if I answered your question, but it's all of these elements put together, and I feel like we have to do something about it as humanity. We can't just sit and accept things that are going wrong or things that are going in the wrong direction and say, you know what, that's not my space to talk, that's not my space to touch. We can't afford to as human beings anymore.
And that is, when we look at the layers of empathy, yes, it starts with empathy for self, even like, okay, I have to understand that I'm not going to be perfect, and I can have empathy for that. But what is that showing me? Like, there's got to be something here that I can do that can address what's going on within, so that then I can look outside at what's going on within my family, within my community. We've got to do something, as you said, about what is the state of our being within our human element and how we're going to navigate that. Because when we can't find teachers to teach our children because of the state that we're in right now, that's speaking to a grander issue. When parents are now anticipated to homeschool their children because we can't find enough teachers, but they don't have the time to because both parents have to work, or there's a single parent and their only option is to work, then how are children going to learn the foundation of having empathy? They're on their own, right? So, and their only option is to learn from an online element. And that computer isn't going to teach them empathy because it's a machine. It's not, there's no human element to that. So everything you're pointing out does reflect, okay, how are we going to solve this? How are we? What are the base elements? And the more that we talk about this and the more we point out, there are tools, there are things that we can do, but how are we going to implement them?
And you're absolutely right. The tools could potentially be going back to some stories, moral stories that were written. I grew up with my great-grandmother who was living with us at that time, and then my grandma, and then my mother. We used to hear the fairy tales, but the fairy tales of my time growing up in my culture, my society, they were not the love stories. They were not the little princess falling in love with a prince and being carried away. Our stories, or my stories, were mostly moral stories that I grew up with, things about lying and cheating and theft and um, justice, really, even, what unjust people end up, seeing in life, and how do just people who are just in their cause and in their actions, how they're rewarded. And so as a child, I think it's important to be raised with these elements of being bigger than yourself, right? So that, it's interesting, because my part of the world today is a very troubled, meaning my part where I came from, Afghanistan. And Afghanistan right now is a story that is kind of seen and presented and reported as a horrific, vicious place for these people that are called the Taliban, and they're just monsters, and they're, doing everything and anything in their capacity to hurt a society, particularly its women. And I get that. I'm not denying the fact that there's a lot of horrible things happening in that society. But as I sit, thousands of miles away from my country today, and I reflect on, a group of people that, yes, they are ruling, or they're wanting to rule with a different set of rules and values and things that are near and dear to them. I just always ask myself, when the reporters or the politicians or leaders stamp a group even as vicious as we may call it, the Taliban, do we ever even think the environments or the families in which they grew up? Why are they the way they are? And it, a movement like the Taliban doesn't come to fruition overnight. Some elements of politics have invested in that particular group for many, many years. This is a product of many years of training and education, and a belief that has been instilled and nurtured and fed. And today, if they're out of that project, if we may call it, and they're practicing what they have been taught, we're then punishing them for believing what they believe. Yet nobody ever takes the critical matter into their heart to understand, why are we punishing those who are implementing, when we need to go back to the roots of what caused this?